Alright, in this video we're going to look at the last of the three possibilities. We're going to look at what happens when we convert back and forth between tables and equations. So let's start. We're going to go from an equation to a table. It says here, when we go from an equation to a table, all we need to do is substitute the value of the known variable, which sometimes might be x, sometimes might be y, from the table into the equation, and then calculate the value of the unknown variable. So we're going to start here with the equation y equals 2x minus 5. My first table entry, I know that x is 3, and I want to find y. So I'm just going to go ahead and put 3 into the equation for x and calculate the value of y. And y is 1 for that value, so I'll fill that into my table. In the second example here, we have no x value, but we know that y is 11. So we're going to solve for the x value. We're going to put 11 in for y and solve this equation for x. So we'll add 5 to both sides and divide both sides by 2. And we get that that occurs when x equals 8. I'll fill that into my table for the x value when y is 11. And we'll proceed and do these last two in exactly the same way. Here in the third row, we have that x is 14. So we're going to put 14 into the equation in place of x and calculate. 2 times 14 gives me 28. And then 28 minus 5 gives me 23. And so that's going to be my y value that goes into the table there. And the last one, we have that y is 37. So we're going to put 37 into this equation for y and solve it for x. And we'll add 5 to both sides and divide both sides by 2. And we get that the x value is 21. And we filled all our values into our table. And that's how we can go from an equation to a table. We'll always know one of the values here and be selecting the other one. Or we'll have the option to fill in, x values entirely into a table and generate our own y values for the x values that we select. All right. Now we're going to go the other direction. And going the other direction is a little bit more difficult. Going from a table to an equation, I think, is the most difficult of the transformations from one form of a linear equation to another. We're going to need to figure out two things from the table to go from a table to an equation. First thing we need to figure out is the unit rate of change in the table. And we find out the unit rate of change in the table. That's going to be the slope of our equation. We find that out by taking the change in y between two entries and dividing it by the change in x. And that's what we're going to do first. The other thing we need to figure out in order to write the equation from this table, we need to figure the value that would appear in the table when the independent variable, in this case that's x, when x is 0. And that value usually doesn't appear in our table, so we usually have to do some work to find it. That's going to end up being the y-intercept in the equation. And then we're just going to use slope-intercept form. We're going to take the slope that we found, and we're going to take the y-intercept that we found and substitute them into the y equals mx plus b form, and that's going to give us the equation that represents this table. So the first thing I'm going to do is I can pick any two values, two rows from this table. So I'm going to pick the first and the second because I'm boring. But you can pick any two rows from this table in order to find the unit rate of change in the table. And in order to do that now, we want to find the change in y and divide it by the change in x. So as I went from the first entry to the second entry, the y value increased by 6. 14 minus 8 is 6. And so the change in y is 6 as I go from 8 to 14. I'm going to find the same change in the x values. As I go from 2 to 4, I increased by 2. And so my rate of change, my unit rate of change here, I'm going to take 6 divided by 2. It's going to give me 3. This is my slope. Okay, Now the other thing I need to do is figure out what the value is when x is 0. Now sometimes I'll use the unit rate of change to do that, and sometimes I'll just use the information that's in the table to help me do that. I'll talk about both different ways here. Since the first two entries in the table have x values of 2 and 4, the distance between those two entries is the same as the distance between 0 and this first entry at 2. And so the difference between the y values has to be the same as well. So since my y value increased by 6 as I went from where x is 2 to where x is 4, my y value will decrease by 6 as I go from where x is 2 to where x is 0. And so my y value there would be 2. Another way of doing that, since we know the unit rate of change is 3, all we'd have to do, since we're going from 2 to 0, is count down by 3 twice. Since you count down from 2 to 0, you go 2, 1, 0. You counted down 2 numbers. If you subtracted 3 from this 8 twice, it would get you to that same value of 2. And so that means that the y-intercept is positive 2. Now using y equals mx plus b, we've got y equals 3x plus 2. And that is the equation that represents this table. And if I wanted to, I could verify that by just taking the x values from the table, substituting them into the equation for x, and seeing, do they give me the y value that appears in the table for that particular x value. So, maybe I do that for 7. I take 3 times 7 plus 2. I want to make sure that that's 23, and it is. Do the same thing with 9. Put 9 in there. 3 times 9 plus 2 should give me 29, and it does. I could do that with any of the values in the table. When x is 4, put 4 in there. I should get 14. And one more time, we'll do it when x is 2. And this should be 8, and it is. And so our equation matches the information that we have in the table. All right, that's the end of this lesson on converting between tables and equations. And this is the last video of Unit 5. You're getting there, folks. Keep it up, keep working hard, and I'll see you next time.